Hello friends, welcome to the special lecture Symbolic Expression, and as sign language expert we have Manisha Sharma in the studio with us. And in the series which we are doing on issues in world history 20th century, today we will talk about imperialism. In the earlier lectures on imperialism, we talked about the kind of definition of imperialism, we talked about the various theories with regard to imperialism, and we also talked about the various kinds of phases which we have seen in over a period of time, that how imperialism it grew and developed across the world, and how it also made those kinds of impact or the changes across the world that was also being discussed. And we talked about how industrial revolution, which appeared in Britain for the first time, played an important role in terms of making Britain and thereafter Europe as one of the most dominant continent in that framework. And before that also we talked about that how the geographical discoveries etc. from the 15th 16th century onwards, they played an important role, where we find more trade routes they were being opened, and how different countries of the world from Asia and Africa they were being exploited by these big powers from Europe. And we also see that when you talk about British hegemony, we see that how a number of developments or improvements they were also being made in transport and communications, and how the rapid transfer of industrial technology also took place from one region to another in Europe. And there was also an increase in the manufacturing output as well. We find that how machines they produced more and more goods, because of which the products, the number of products in terms of production also increased. We also see that how it also in turn stimulated the opening of the new areas of agricultural land and raw material sources as well. So in that sense, this particular period was good from the economic point of view for the entire Europe. And as we talked about initially in the mercantile phase, and thereafter we talk about the industrial phase, when we see that how raw materials they were being carried from the less developed areas to Europe. And when you talk about the age of mercantilism, which became over, and with its tariff barriers they stood dismantled as well. And now we were talking about laissez-faire or the free trade, and this brought international harmony in that sense rather than the great power conflict. So we see that this idea of free trade was an important concern, because we see that European powers they were more interested in getting the raw materials from the less developed regions to Europe, and they wanted to in a way export the finished products from there, so to these less developed regions or to the colonies. And we find that how over a period of time the military superiority of Europe it increased, and we could see it in the framework of the improvements in the muzzle loading gun, introduction of breech loader. Then we also see that how Maxim and light field artillery, all of them they played an important role in terms of firepower revolution, which was not present in the traditional societies, and they did not have the kind of money to invest in this kind of a revolution as well. And we see that in that particular framework the decisive new technology was gun, and the symbol of European superiority in the armament factory. So how this technology was being used to increase their firepower, and we also see that many of the colonies they had those kinds of resources as well. Especially India, we find that some advances could have been made with the kind of wealth which was available in India, but we find that during the medieval ages or during the Mughal period, not much development could take place in that sense in the framework of the military technology, which could have definitely played an important role in keeping the British away from India. But we see that how Britain it was able to develop these kinds of guns and technology, and it could also use them against the colonies as well. And scholars like Hilaire Belloc has argued that whatever happens, we have got Maxim gun and they have not. So, in that sense, definitely technology played an important role, and we find that how over a period of time the British Empire continued to grow, and it also did not have many rivals as well. We find that it grew at an annual rate of 1 lakh square miles between 1815 and 1865, which was a huge area. And when you would see the kind of colonies which were available with Britain, how they comprised those acquired for the strategic and commercial reasons like Singapore, Aden, Falkland Island, Hong Kong and Lagos. And another group was that of settler colonies such as South Africa, Canada, Australia, and we see it in the framework of India as well. And when we talk about the industrial capitalism, then we find that with the spread of the industrial capitalism, there was a need to grow for the colonies as markets for the manufactured goods, and which happens in the case of India as well, especially the textiles, and how the colonies, they had to become the suppliers of raw material like cotton and food grains, so that the factories of the world they could survive on these food grains and the raw materials. And so in that sense, colonies, how they emerged as a subordinate trading partner whose economic surplus was appropriated through the trade based on unequal exchange. And this international division of labor condemned the colony to producing the goods of low value using the backward techniques. And on the other hand, we see that how the developed world, it was getting richer and richer by seeking raw materials from these less developed regions. And we also see during this time that the countries which were the late industrializers, and they became the later colonial powers as well, like Germany and US, and how they were trying to catch up with Britain in industrialization as well. And we see that how Britain, especially in 1900, it was the unquestioned world leader, and her empire extended to 12 million square miles and a quarter of world population as well. And we find that the race for the colonies, it speeded up from 1880s with the entry of Germany, Italy, US, Belgium and Japan into the race for colonies. And these rivalries between powers led to a race for new colonies, as each power sought to secure her markets, raw materials and investments. So, there we also see in the framework of the secret alliances which were happening between various powers, and because of these secret alliances, which could also be seen in the framework of one of the reasons for the First World War, and seeking more and more colonies for themselves was also one of the reasons for the First World War. And we find that how the backward regions, they were annexed in order to control their raw material supplies, and Malaya gave rubber and tin, and Middle East gave oil. So in that sense, empire was a cushion in a hard world. And how these imperialist rivalries which carved up world into colonies, semi-colonies and spheres of influence also divided Europe into blocks armed to teeth, logical corollary of which was the First World War. So we find that this kind of imperial rivalries for colonies, semi-colonies, spheres of influence, protectorates, it also created a bitter situation among many of the powers of the world, especially Europe, when they were vying for the colonies. And we find that how when the World War ended in the defeat of Germany, and how the redivision of the colonies took place among the imperial powers, and they were called as trustees, and they were trustees because they brought some kind of an idea in the Treaty of Versailles, when League of Nations, it was in a way established, and this issue of trusteeship was in a way was there in the charter of the League of Nations, or the provisions of the League of Nations. And we find that in 1920s we also witnessed the Great Depression, and how this brought a change in the attitude of the imperial powers, when we find that the issue of free trade was not being discussed now, and protectionism was the new catchword, because each country had to survive, and each country had to in a way safeguards its own economy. And another important phase was the phase of the finance capitalism, where we find that the stages of capitalism and imperialism could overlap as well. And in the case of industrial capitalism and financial capitalism, where one did not replace other, it was superimposed on it. And the informal empire of trade and finance was added to the empire of industrial capital. And we find that a number of changes which were very significant, they took place in the world economy after 1860, and how industrialization it spread to the several countries of the world, and US and Japan, with the result that the Britain's industrial supremacy in the world came to an end. And for this, for Britain, we find that this was a huge setback, because Britain was dominating the world, and we find that it could not withstand the pressures which were coming from other countries. And we find that how she exchanged informal empire over most of the underdeveloped world for the formal empire of a quarter of it, plus the older satellite economies as well. So we see that how over a period of time the application of the scientific knowledge to the industries led to an intensification of industrialization, and how so many modern chemical industries where the use of petroleum as fuel for the internal combustion engine and use of electricity for industrial purposes developed during this particular period. And these were remarkable discoveries in that sense, and how we find that how it was also led to some kind of a unification of the world market because of the revolution in the means of international transport. So we find that changes in transport technology, they were also coming, and it was important as well, so as to transport the goods especially from one region to another. And this we see in the framework of the railways as well, that how railways, when they were initiated, especially in India, when we talk about they were playing an important role in terms of movements of goods from one area to another, and the way they were being designed in India, that they were being connected from port towns in a way to the areas in which the production was taking place. So from the interior regions, they were being connected to the port towns, so that the things could be exported to Britain. And we also see that the capital accumulation on a large scale also took place because of the development of trade and industry at home, and extended exploitation of colonies and the semi colonies as well. And this capital was concentrated in a few hands. Trust and cartels emerged, and the banking capital merged with the industrial capital. And we see that how the outlets had to be found for this capital abroad as well. So we see that how the big banking corporations, they wanted that kind of a money to be invested abroad, because when they will, because the returns on the investments will be comparatively less in the developed countries. So the investment had to be there in the less developed countries, so that they are able to give higher returns. And we see that the significant export of capital had been there even before the stage of predominance of finance capital. And by 1850 we find that Britain's capital exports were 30 million pounds a year. In 1870-75 this was 75 million pounds. So how over a period of time the kind of money which was available with Britain, it was also increasing, and it was increasing because of the fact that how they were able to secure raw materials from the colonies, and how they were using these raw materials to their own advantage. And when you talk about that how this kind of capital exports they were also generating a lot of income, and income from them was nearly 50 million pounds, and how this money was again reinvested overseas as well. So, this finance trade with the colonies, wherein the huge quantities of raw materials were produced or they were being procured, and equally the vast quantities of industrial goods, they were also being sent out. And we find that how some kind of a stranglehold of the monopoly capital can be gauged from the statistic that by 1914 European nations, they controlled over 84.4% of the world trade, and the capital was in that was concentrated in and channeled through first the city of London and then New York. And we also see that the centers of international network of trade and finance as well. And we also find that how the metropolitan country also used the empire for the political and ideological ends as well, where we find that the jingoistic nationalism and glorification of the empire acted to reduce the social divisions in metropolis. So, we find that this kind of a glorification of the empire, British Empire, was taking place, and the kind of nationalism which was exhibited during this time, which is also being seen as one of the reasons for the First World War, was also on the rise. And scholars like Bipin Chandra has argued that the sun never sets on the British Empire. It generated pride among the British workers, and how British, they were feeling so proud of themselves that they had so many colonies. They were not thinking in the terms of exploiting so many people across the world, so many countries across the world, but this kind of a false sense of pride was generated among the British so as to exploit these colonies. And they were trying to justify them as well in the name of civilizing mission of the French and the Pan-Asianism of Japan, where they were arguing that how they were civilizing the natives who were in a way rude, those who were not those who were non-civilized, those who were barbaric in nature. And we see that how between 1870 and 1913 London was the financial and the trading hub of the world, and most of the international trade was routed through British ships at the turn of the 20th century. So, we find that these kinds of economic developments, they were in favor of Britain, and after the First World War, how Britain lost its position to US. US became a major dominant capitalist economy, and she was now world's largest manufacturer as well. It was a great foreign investor, trader and banker, and how the US dollar became the standard international currency. So, after the First World War, the dominance of US increased, and especially after the Second World War, we find that how USA and USSR, both of them, they emerged as superpowers. So, in that sense, from the mid 20th century onwards, we find that some ideas regarding decolonization, they were also being talked about, as did the rise of the multinational corporations as well, and the international donor agencies and the entire gamut of the mechanisms of international economic influence, and this process is generally known as neo-colonialism. So, we find that from the First World War, where US, it established its hegemony in some sense, and this was complete, where we find that after the Second World War, US became one of the most dominant nations of the world, and how this kind of a dominance from the economic point of view could also be seen in the dominance of the multinational corporations or the transnational corporations and big companies, and how these companies, they started some kind of a chain of events in the framework of neo-colonialism. And how Bipin Chandra has argued in the framework of the simultaneity of the birth of industrial revolution in the British Empire in India, which interestingly was not merely coincidental. And when you see it in the framework of India, how Battle of Plassey, where we find the Battle of Plassey, Battle of Buxar, and systematic loot and plunder of India, it started to be taken place and it was connected with the industrial revolution in Britain as well, because how raw materials from India, they were being taken away to Britain, and how British industries, they were thriving from the raw materials which were taken from India. Apart from the raw materials, we also find a lot of drain of wealth, how unilateral transfer of capital from India was also taking place after 1765, where we find that when the British, they got the Diwani rights of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, and we find that it amounted to 2 to 3% of the British national income at a time when only 5% of the British national income was being invested. So, we see that how India was being used as a colony by the British, and how it was also being used as a market for the British manufactured products. And India, on the other hand, was also only supplying food grains and the raw materials, and how opium from India was sold in China, which was some kind of a triangular trade. It was being created, and this kind of a triangular trade was again to the benefit of the British, because they were exporting tea from China to Britain. And how railways, where we find a lot of money was invested in the railways, and how British investors, they were getting a lot of dividends from these investments, the kind of money or the interest which they would not get in Britain, the kind of money which they were getting in India. And this in a way helped the international balance of payments of Britain. And we also find that British shipping, etc., it grew leaps and bounds during this period because of its control over the Indian coastal and the international trade as well. So, definitely India played an important role in the development of the British capitalism, where we find that how British industries, they were dependent on the Indian raw material, as well as we also find that they were also dependent on the kind of exports which were being made from Britain, and how India absorbed 10 to 12% of British exports and nearly 20% of British textile export during 1860 to 1880. And we also see that how India also imported, especially after 1850, engine coaches, rail lines and other railway stores. And we also see that Indian army played an important role in extending British colonialism in Asia and Africa. So, in that sense, we find that Britain wanted to continue its Indian empire, not only for the raw material, not only for the markets, but also for its military strength, where we find that Indian soldiers, they played an important role in the various campaigns which were undertaken by the British in different parts of the world, especially the First World War and the Second World War as well. And when you talk about the drain of wealth, we also talk about the home charges, which is India's payments for receiving good administration from Britain, and interest payments on Indian public debt. They were important in financing the Britain's balance of payment deficit as well. So, in that sense, we find that how Britain, it in a way got a lot of support from India, how Britain was able to become some kind of a big capitalist country by exploiting the resources from India. And India was always talked about as a brightest jewel in the British crown, and it played an important role in the ideology of imperialism, and how British ruling classes, they were able to keep their political power intact even when it was being divided with class conflict as well. And the ideas of pride and glory, they were underlining the slogans of sun never sets on the British Empire. They were being used by the British to keep their workers contented, on whose slum dwellings sun seldom shone in real life. So, India was being exploited by the British. This is what we find, and how British, they tried to introduce their education system, modern legal system, development of irrigation and detailed penetration of administration into countryside, so as to suit their own purpose, so that India is ideologically in that sense attuned to the colonial empire which they were able to establish in India. Thank you very much.